Grazie Presidente, buongiorno a tutti. Unfortunately, my Italian is not good enough to do my presentation in your language, so I hope you will accept that I will do it in English. I will present to you the Clean Power for Transport initiative, and I would like to thank the organizers for having invited the European Commission to do this today for you. Clean Power for Transport initiative, which was adopted by the College of Commissioners on the 24th of January. So it is a very recent package, which consists of three elements. One, which is more a political document called a communication on a strategy for alternative fuels. The second element, which is a legislative proposal in the form of a directive on the deployment of infrastructure for alternative fuels. And then a third element, which is also of interest to you, which is LNG in shipping. But why do we do this? So the first reason is that transport is over-dependent on oil. Oil imports cost daily 1 billion euros in imports, which translates into roughly 7% of household expenditure per year. 94% of transport is dependent on oil products. So the idea is to smoothly go away from oil. Second reason is that we have committed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as far as 60% by 2050. This is what our overarching strategy for transport for the next decade, this so-called white paper, announces. Then we have to think also in terms of mobility in a more wider perspective. I think the chairman had mentioned intermodality. We have to think about other forms of mobility. And then we have also to think about the competitiveness of our industry, of the automobile industry, of the energy sector, and I think that this package would be a good contribution for this. In order to reach the sustainable transport market, which you see on top of the slide, a lot has been done until now, like research projects, also funded by the European Commission. There have been regulatory measures on greenhouse gas emissions, CO2, on pollutants, on green procurement of vehicles by public authorities. And there have been also market incentives in terms of subsidies, fiscal advantages granted by member states, EIB loans. But we think that in order to reach this sustainable transport market, there's one missing link which has still to be closed, which is infrastructures and common standards. And this is what our directive addresses. Until now, of course, member states and you, industry, have done lots of efforts in order to reach the sustainable transport market. But we think that if there is no regulation at European level, this could lead to isolated markets, to fragmented markets along member states' borders. This would lead then to a hampering of cross-border mobility of our citizens. So what we propose through this initiative is to build this sustainable transport market, to establish a long-term fuel strategy, to remove regulatory and technological barriers, and try to develop through this initiative a single market for vehicles and vessels. So as I said, there are three elements: the communication, which is the political document setting out a strategy for the future, then the directive, the legislative element, which is about focusing on this missing link, infrastructure and standards, and the staff working document on LNG for shipping. So the communication, just briefly, is the political thinking behind the legislative proposal. It sets the strategy of the Commission in this policy area, and it is, let's say, the political framework. Of course, with the package of alternative fuels. We do not stop other efforts, which of course continue, like research and development, different projects which are funded by the European Commission. Of course, the European transport networks are still in the highlight. You will see also a link between the trans-European networks and the directive on alternative fuels in a moment. And our colleagues in the Taxation and Customs Union Directorate General, of course, work on the taxation implications of the alternative fuels. On this slide, which I suppose if the organizers give you the presentation or make it accessible, you will see that we are technologically neutral in our approach. We do not impose one or two alternative fuels and we leave market forces to decide themselves, ultimately the consumer. So for the different transport modes and the different transport ranges, short, medium, of course urban, short, medium and long range, you see that there is a mix of alternative fuels available. We have only listed here on this presentation the alternative fuels for which this minimum infrastructure and the common standards do not exist yet. So the legislative proposal in the form of a directive contains two types of obligations for the member states. It is addressed to the member states, which have to implement the directive into national legislation. One obligation is an obligation of means, that is, member states have to produce national frameworks on alternative fuels. Some member states are already advanced, they have produced them, they are in the making. Others are not so far advanced. And then there is a second obligation, which is an obligation of results, the build-up of a minimum infrastructure for alternative fuels. Concerning, for instance, the electric vehicles, which are mentioned in the directive, the targets which are set for the recharging points are mainly targets which the member states have set themselves. And for those member states which have not done so, we have used a formula to extrapolate figures from the vehicle fleet, urbanization rate, and this is the result then in terms of figures which are contained in the directive. This directive does not just come out of the blue. It is the result of 3 years of work with industry, stakeholders of all kinds, and member states. It is based on an impact assessment study, which is also downloadable from our website. And the purpose is to give a strong political signal concerning alternative fuels and to unlock private investment. So this is very much a pro-business initiative. A political signal, a regulatory framework, and then it is up to you, industry, to build up this infrastructure and for consumers to take them up. So now, concretely, for the different alternative fuels which are covered by the obligation to create this minimum infrastructure, I mentioned electric vehicles, recharging points. There should be around 8 million recharging points in the whole EU, of which 10% publicly accessible. For hydrogen, the obligation is for those member states which already have some sort of infrastructure, some very minimum infrastructure in terms of refueling stations, to develop this into a network with a maximum distance between refueling points of 300 kilometers. Now, for the purposes of this conference, LNG refueling points, we have to make the distinction between refueling points for waterborne transport, sea-going vessels, and inland navigation vessels, where these refueling points, which are 139 in total for the whole trans-European transport core network. for 2020 for the seagoing vessels or in the maritime ports, and 2025 in the inland navigation ports. LNG for road transport, which is trucks. The directive proposes a maximum distance between refueling points of 400 kilometers. Then CNG, where Italy is certainly the front runner, CNG for passenger cars and light commercial vehicles, but there are also developments in the heavy-duty vehicle sector, recharging points, 150 kilometers maximum distance among themselves. Of course, this is the minimum infrastructure for all member states. Some member states are more advanced in certain types of technologies than others. So that means that some member states will already have exceeded the targets which are contained in the directive. The other element concerning this initiative, the legislative proposal, is to create common standards by 2015. This is being done by the European Standardization Committee, CEN, and we are in the process of asking this committee to see what standards already exist, which can be adapted to the needs of the directive, which possible international ISO, IEC standards exist, which could be translated into European standards through international agreements which exist among standardization organizations, and which standards have to be created from scratch. Concerning the electric vehicle, which is highlighted here, the plug, the European Commission has followed the recommendation of the Association of European Car Manufacturers and also of the European Electricity Utilities, which is the so-called Type 2 plug. Of course, we have not to forget the consumer, which is ultimately the one in mind for the legislative proposal, consumer acceptance. So for this alternative fuels market to take up, there is the need for consumer acceptance. Here the directive will impose the obligation to have information displayed on the refueling stations, on the vehicles, and in the vehicle manuals. This might sound obvious, but sometimes it is not. There was, for instance, a communication mishap concerning a blending of biofuels in one member state in the recent past, and consumers were confused whether their car could use this E10 blended petrol or not, and manufacturers were not very proactive in giving this information. So just to be sure, we have put an article in the directive on consumer information. Of course, there is the aware consumer who knows that with his or her CNG car cannot put LPG in the car and vice versa, but we have to think about giving the consumers all kind of information. So to sum up, the idea of the directive is to create confidence for investors for their investments and development of technological products, and confidence for consumers that the vehicles they will purchase will not be outdated in the future or in the recent future, and that interoperability among the refueling points and their vehicles is given in all EU member states. The idea is maybe not to drive from Hamburg to Rome with an electric vehicle, but if you live near a border to another member state, at least if you go over the border for whatever reasons, that you will be able to refill or recharge your vehicle. So stable framework, legislative framework, common standards, and consumer information, these are the three main elements contained in the directive, or the main ideas, and then, of course, the obligations to create the minimum infrastructure and the elaboration of common standards. Thank you very much.